Today we'll be working with Japanese white pine, and the goal for the day is to learn how to wire pads out to a flat form on the bottom with a rounded top.
This collected Japanese white pine was brought to Kokain Nursery for refinement and styling. The bottom half had weakened and died off, so the tree's owner had allowed it to grow freely to strengthen the remaining branches. After several seasons, the growth had become leggy and needed to be wired to hide the tree's less attractive aspects. Beginning with the bottom branches, the tree was wired to the foliage tips and balanced pads were established. By thinking 2 steps ahead, wire crossing was also avoided. In addition, the directionality of branch movement was considered when wrapping the wire. Tertiary branches were wired with a thinner gauge to match their natural taper. When wrapping smaller branches, it is okay to anchor the smaller gauge wire to a larger gauge by crossing the two at the end. This keeps the wire from separating from the branch during placement. Lastly, each branch was wired to its tip with the last loop made under the foliage.
So at this point we've wired about 1/3 of the way up the tree. We've started with the bottom and we're working our way towards the top as usual. If you notice here, we've created the effect that these pads actually have a rounded top with a flat bottom here. Now, the way we've done that is by wiring out to the tips, flipping up the tips of the branches, and using the smaller branches to cover over on the inside. This creates an effect that the tree actually has back buds when it doesn't. So at this point we've wired the tree all the way to the top, and all we have left to do is place the branches here at the apex. Now this will be difficult as the foliage is sparse here, but the goal is to create a rounded top to make the tree look as old as possible. There's several different types of Japanese white pines that can be used for bonsai culture. This one here would be a standard Japanese white pine. This tree was collected out of the mountains of Japan probably about 70 years ago. It's been in a pot for about 70 years. The trunk has thickened up quite a bit over those years, but as you can tell, this is a chokan style, which is a formal upright. It tapers great from the base all the way to the top. There's no graft in the trunk whatsoever, so that's how we know that this is absolutely a base species Pinus parviflora. The foliage is also very, very light on this tree. If you touch it, it actually bends quite easily. So on standard Japanese white pines, the foliage is quite a bit softer than what you would find on a grafted white pine. This particular variety is what is known in Japan as Miyajima Goyomatsu or Setsugoyo, which is a white pine top grafted onto a black pine root base. Now the reason they do that in Japan is because regular white pine root bases are relatively weak in comparison to black pines, so we graft it onto black pine bases to give it more stability and strength, and it also fattens up quicker than a typical white pine. Now the way we identify this type of tree is by looking at the foliage and at the bark itself. You notice the foliage here is a bit harder than Japanese white pine, your standard Japanese white pine. It's a little more coarse, it's a bit more of a bluish color as well. The bark on the tree here, you can tell that this is a graft because the base here has thicker plated bark than does the top of the tree. Now, some Japanese white pines that are grafted onto black pine bases are very difficult to tell because the grafts are so old and they've grown together so well that the bark has actually started to meld together, and it becomes very difficult to tell where that graft actually took place. Now this one is pretty obvious. You can tell it was done here right in the center. The top of the tree is actually a bit thinner than the bottom. Like I said before, the base of black pines will thicken up faster than your typical white pine. So you can tell a big difference between the base and the top of this tree. Unlike Japanese black pines and Japanese red pines, white pines or Pinus parviflora cannot be decandled in the summertime. If we were to apply the same techniques to white pines as we do to black and red pines, the branches on the white pine would die off. Now, the way that we control needle length on white pine is by reducing water and reducing fertilizer over the course of the summer. Now, typically with white pines we don't fertilize at all during the summer, and we actually wait until the fall season rolls around. Usually starting late September into October, we fertilize for a couple of months, allow the trees to gather up that energy to store it over winter. That way when it comes around to the next spring and they put out that new flush of growth, they already have that energy stored up to push that flush out.